from my slides. I'm Brahm Norwich from the School of Education, and I'm talking about deliberative democratic dialogue in higher education and teaching. And I want to start off by showing you a quote from Rory Stewart in a very interesting Radio 4 program series called The Long History of Argument from last year. And he said, "We live in a time when argument defines us and divides us." And I saw this intimately and directly as a member of parliament. We all feel it through the intensity of arguments on social media. But for all its dangers, I still passionately believe in the value of argument and why arguing well and truthfully matters so much for our democracies and our lives. And it's really that last section, why arguing well and truthfully matters so much to our democracies and our lives, which I guess is the sort of theme of what I'm going to present. So just to say a bit about the aims and then how I'm going to utilize the time. The aim is to consider whether increased use of deliberative dialogue approaches could enhance higher education, undergraduate and postgraduate teaching and learning. And what I've got organized is to set this in the context of contemporary universities, talking mainly about the social purposes of universities, talking about a bit about deliberative democratic approaches, and then hopefully I'll finish sort of halfway through, and depending on how many people are here, get into a few groups for you to spend the other half of the time talking and then feeding back your ideas to a number of questions. So I'm going to start off by showing you the strategy 2030 for the University of Exeter, which is to use the power of our education and research to create a sustainable, healthy, and socially just future. And then this is broken down into three broad areas, which you can see. One to do with climate emergency, one to do with transforming health and well-being. And the last one on the right, which I'm pointing to, is leading the progress towards creating a fair, socially just and inclusive society. And I think the thing that strikes me about this is all very well intentioned, very broad and comprehensive, but rather sort of lacking in detail. And how does one sort of put these into some kind of practical vision? So I thought I would sort of look at another university. So I chose University College London, partly because some years ago I used to work at the Institute of Education, which is now part of University College. And you can see it has a similar sort of approach to its vision and mission. And you can see the same reference to research, education, and innovation, and the idea of a community of students and staff and how knowledge is created and shared and the way that global problems are solved. And then the mission talks about a diverse intellectual community engaged with the wider world, talking about its own radical traditions of critical thinking, and the notion at the end there of innovation and enterprise for the long-term benefit of humanity. I think they're very similar sort of format and style. So I want to talk a bit about some of the commentaries and critiques of this, and I'm going to sort of draw on the work of Ron Barnett. And I think in a way that's partly because Ron Barnett identifies some of the traditions of commentary and critique. And I think he identifies the rise of an entrepreneurial university in the context of the sort of global knowledge economy, marketization and neoliberal traditions. And he identifies three types of criticisms, which are, might be used jointly or not, but I think they're interesting to consider. One is the sort of notion that the entrepreneurial university is a form of academic capitalism with strong emphasis on performativity. Another one where there's a critique of the slow take-up of opportunities to develop universities, a borderless university and collaborative university. And the third one, which I think is particularly interesting, is the sort of question of what are the communicative conditions that make it worthy of its name. And that's very much within the critical tradition. But his point is that there have been really few practical details of what that would mean. His particular take, whatever one thinks of it, is to argue for more imaginative thinking about the university in the contemporary society, an imagination that offers us some sort of what he calls feasible utopias. And he talks about an ecological university which is intertwined with the global knowledge economy, but seeks spaces to live out the values embedded in the university. And the values he's talking about are truthfulness, inquiry, critical dialogue, rational dispute, and even iconoclastic endeavor. So, I mean, those views are around. You can see the date, 2013, that's sort of 10 years. I mean, a more recent interesting paper I've come across by Conway, an Australian review of international views of Western-style universities, which is about the contested ideas and possible futures for the university. And Conway says, if today's discourse continues to draw only on the university's past, the traditional idea, and the present, the managerial idea, the full range of its possible futures will not be made visible. So I want to sort of examine a bit what seems to be a potential dichotomy or tension between the individual aims of universities and focus on how they benefit individuals and how they benefit society, the public good, the public interest. And I've sort of identified a number of statements of individual outcomes and benefits and aims on the left, and on the right, some others. Now, I mean, this is not comprehensive, but sort of well-known comments like achieving higher order cognitive skills, opportunity to enjoy a subject that you're passionate about, opportunity to create lifelong friendships, occupation preparation, attaining an entrepreneurial mindset, challenging prejudice. Many of these sort of are seen as ways of sometimes even selling why you should go to university. On the social public side, I mean, obviously the sort of notion of universities as guardians of reason, universities as advancing the frontiers of knowledge, and of course, social mobility. I mean, it seems to me that there is some imbalance, that the emphasis is very strongly to the individual, and some people would say this reflects the current sort of climate that focuses on public service value for money, the idea that the customer pays. But I do think it does suggest a fairly poorly developed concept of the social and public interest in relation to higher education universities. And this is where I want to sort of bring in the ideas of a political theory of education, which have been formulated by someone called Amy Gutman. And I must confess, I've only heard of Amy Gutman's views in the last couple of years. The question Amy Gutman is answering, she's an American political philosopher, political scientist, and has actually been president of the University of Pennsylvania for many years, and is currently ambassador, US ambassador to Germany. So she's very well known in American circles, if not in UK circles. I'd certainly not heard the sort of notion of a political theory of education. So I'm going to say a bit about Gutman's ideas, which sort of started in a very famous in 1989, updated 99, and more recently, a very interesting interview with her in 2018, where she talks about democratic education, democratic deliberation, as central to a public education and a plural society, and that the focus on education is for securing individual freedom and opportunity and mutual respect. And she argues that when democracy is not deliberative, people are treated as passive or controlled and ruled, that citizens' deliberation, by which she means the giving and receiving of reasons and participating in governance, And she also sees deliberative democracy as a form of lifelong education. I think that's a point I'll come back to. For Gutman, in her particular version of democratic education, learning to deliberate is a fundamental aspect of democratic citizenship. Schools and universities are responsible, she would say, for preparing students to participate in democratic processes. And this is a quote from the introduction in the 1999 version, that it's about cultivating the skills and virtues of deliberative citizenship. And her argument is that the pursuit of justice depends on these skills and virtues. But her argument is that deliberation is not a single skill or virtue, and also that it's not always learned directly through direct teaching. It is often learned indirectly and is learned currently indirectly. It depends on the skills of literacy, numeracy, critical thinking, appreciation of others' perspectives, and various other elements on the skill side. And on the virtue side, the virtues involved in deliberation include veracity, nonviolence, practical judgment, civic integrity, and magnanimity. And you will notice the link there back to the very general purposes of universities and the two universities that I focus on. So let me just sort of say a bit about deliberative dialogue and deliberative democratic approaches. I mean, there's, spent a long time about what is the definition of it, but usually deliberative dialogue is about the careful consideration and discussion of reasons for and against a position, that it involves face-to-face interaction, it involves discussion and debate, assumption that at least initially there are different positions held by the participants which should be respected, and that the deliberative democratic element introduces the principles of inclusion, deliberation, and citizenship. So I want to say a bit about civic education in schools in England, and then I'll talk a bit about universities, because I think there's a continuity there. The English secondary school national curriculum has 4 citizenship aims. It's a fairly bare document. 2 are about knowledge and understanding about citizen participation in a democracy under the rule of law. 2 are focused on developing an interest in the participation in responsible activities and skills to think critically and debate political questions. But again, when you go from the sort of generic level and talk about the actual attainment targets or objectives, these are really only about knowledge and understanding. And there's a general understanding that in the secondary school system in this country, there's not much promotion of citizenship. But I'll say a bit more about that. There's not much reference to deliberative skills and virtues. And if you look at the inspection framework, which also covers citizenship, this again is done in very general terms. But I want to talk about a very interesting project, over 50 years old, the Humanities Curriculum Project associated with a well-known curriculum theorist education called Lawrence Stenhouse. And Stenhouse was involved in developing in the late 60s and early 70s this approach, which was called teaching in controversial areas. And this was for 14 to 16-year-olds, where the controversial areas were war, education, you can see it, race relations, law and order, where the aim was to develop an understanding of human acts, of social situations, and of the problems of value which arise from them. This was very much a process model of teaching, where the questions were the consistency between the teaching aims and the teaching principles, not the setting of specific learner subject outcomes. And, what people would call an objectives model. This was very much embodying the process. And Stenhouse's project developed 7 principles, and I think these are very important principles. Firstly, the values of rationality, sensitivity, listening, and there are others in that tradition. The importance of teacher neutrality, that basically the teachers there to exercise procedural authority. And the key principle there is to avoid teacher indoctrination. That students are to learn to understand diversity, or divergence was the term he used, to respect minority views, that the students' interests were to be protected as well as their privacy, and that the aim is student understanding, not to force premature conclusions. Now, some people see that project, a very well invested in project, as a failure. Others have said no, it was a singular success, but it certainly went against the grain of the school curriculum, which was very objectives oriented. And certainly there aren't many examples of it nowadays in the school, but it is interesting that the Association of Citizen Education, which is a charity organization with strong government funding, which is very much the tradition, has produced some very interesting models and materials and videos, if you want to see them, of contemporary secondary teaching, which really do embody some of the principles of these 7 principles, the curriculum project. And they call it deliberative class teaching. So I think that's quite interesting. How widespread that is, I really don't know. So I want to move now on to question of deliberative citizenship in universities. Now, one of the things that I've always in teaching is the modules that lecturers have to fill out in order to get a module endorsed and for teaching. And a typical, this is a typical, I mean, literally, I took a random subject, geography, undergraduate. This was a module on the Anthropocene. Basically, the intended learning outcomes of this module are identified in terms of module-specific, discipline-specific, and personal and key skills. And you can see the examples of the guts of the module. It seems to me to be in the module specific and the discipline. The personal key skills tend to be fairly generic across. The question of how they link to the module and discipline, I have always had some questions about. But here you can see 4 in this particular module: communicating ideas, principles, and theories, identifying, acquiring, analyzing, synthesizing information, and developing a sustained and reasoned argument, undertaking and developing independent. And I've highlighted that third one, is the notion of a reasoned argument. So one of the other things I've been interested in is to look how here in the University of Exeter, the university sort of frames these issues of the kind of graduate attributes and key skills that are being promoted through teaching. So I've looked at the Teaching Excellence framework, and these are a list of some of them that are being put forward. This is the 2023 one: intellectual inquiry, problem-solving skills, entrepreneurship, digital literacy, cultural competence, and global citizenship. And some of these are argued to be promoted, the aims of the Grand Challenge. So this is a very interesting program, seen as the flagship program for at least 10 years, where students work in research-led interdisciplinary teams supported by academics, invited speakers to tackle real-world problems, development of several of these. And students obviously report learning various skills: communication, leadership, teamwork, public speaking, presentation skills. But argumentation doesn't seem to feature there. So I want to say a bit about my experiences, how I come to this, and I don't have time to go into much detail, but I just sort of say a bit about personal experience of deliberate activities. I'm a education psychologist by background. I work in the special needs and disability inclusion field, and one of the features of my teaching over the years, over many years, over 10 years, has been to organise a debate. And I'll say a little bit about how this debate works. The aims have been for students to examine, extend their perspectives, have them challenged, deliberate in small and large groups, give and receive reasons, very much informed by the Stenhouse Humanities Project. We're talking about postgraduate master's students and professional doctoral students, about 25 or 30 a year. And the procedure has been to examine and debate a proposal which runs like this. If inclusive education means anything, it means the closure of all special schools in the foreseeable future. So this actually is involved is randomly allocating all the students to 4 groups. 2 of them are preparing the argument for the proposal, 2 against. And it could be that you're in a group which is arguing against your own views on the matter. And that's the point of it. Groups have time to read some provided materials. All the groups have the same materials. They are each expected to contribute to that. And then someone will then argue. And then through that process, it's basically a 2-hour session where 4 people, 2 speak for, 2 speak again, there's open discussion, and then there's a vote, either for, against, or an abstention. And I mean, I could spend a long time talking about this. I mean, by and large, it's a very popular and quite an exciting event. There are clear links between the activity and formal written assignments as part of modules on 2 related but distinct courses. The outcome is, for some people, an unexpected one, which is that despite a very strong ethos of being inclusive, about 2/3, almost every year, I would say every year for a decade, this proposal has not been supported. Most, at least 2/3, are against it. And the debate is a very interesting debate. So that is one area of experience that I've had, where I'm coming from. I think the other area is the sort of deliberative democracy approach. And this has been really about policy ideas, which I've had an interest in nationally. This was a project last year, UKRI funded pilot project to establish a citizens panel. This was a citizens panel that was established in the Portsmouth, Southampton area. I had a colleague at Portsmouth University in which we recruited 28 young people with and without a special need or disability, their parents and educationists, to address the question, how do we make schools more inclusive for children and young people with special needs? Now, the aim of this project, because it was part of a wider project which was looking at innovation in public dialogue, was to try and modify a citizens panel process to enhance the effective participation of young people with special needs or disability, and to generate nuanced, grounded, integrated policy. I can't go into too much of it, so I can see lots of. Basically, the process, the deliberative, the democratic deliberative process involves identifying what's called a diverse mini-public, a panel, in other words, through a process called sortition, where you recruit membership of the panel depending on various criteria. It depends on the aims and the setting for the deliberation. The panel is involved in framing the deliberation rules and the specific question to address, and there is a considerable amount of facilitation in small groups. Basically 3 stages: a learning stage where experts are questioned, evaluating the evidence and positions. There's a deliberating stage where the mapping is a mapping of arguments and opportunities for deliberating, and a deciding stage where examining consensus or dissenting position, and how that is to be expressed. I really can't say too much about this. As I say, it's quite complex. I think certainly the conclusion we have drawn through evaluation and very careful analysis of the panel's outputs was that they did produce distinctive ideas about more inclusive schools. The evaluation of the process showed that participants were both positive, they were both positive and worthwhile experiences, and that, of course, we did operate a fairly differentiated approach in order to involve our young people with special needs and disabilities. And that involved some trade-offs that affected the experience of some of the participants without special needs and disabilities, but not in a detrimental way. So yeah, coming up quite good on timing. So I want to just sort of make a final and sort of go back to some of the sources I've used. I will say a bit about Gutman and Gutman's ideas of a democratic education. And I think Gutman is very aware of the importance of deliberation as an educational process. And I must say, it was the thing that really struck me in my experience in this pilot citizens panel that we ran, the extent to which in the evaluation the notion of learning, not just at a sort of informational level, but at the point of social learning. And Gutman's notion that democratic deliberation is a form of lifelong education, I think that's a really interesting final point. I think Stenhouse's humanities teaching approach, where I think he makes the point that the aim should be understanding, and nor should one see particular virtue in a change of views. And this is not a sort of indirect way to sort of change people's views. I think it's seen as a way of sort of helping people really ground their learning and understanding. And I think a comment he makes, which I think is a sort of a curriculum educational comment, that this approach challenges teachers to make a synthesis of the progressive tradition and the more academic traditions. And I think that's a very interesting comment. And I also sort of finally just refer back to Barnett's sort of notion of the ecological university and his notion of seeking spaces to live out the values embedded in the university: truthfulness, inquiry, critical dialogue, rational dispute, and even iconoclastic endeavor. And I think that in a way, I'm sort of saying, what are the universities doing in this? So finally, really the reason I volunteered is I wanted to people's views on the answers to these questions, really. Whether forms of deliberative dialogue should be used more or in higher education teaching, whether and how lecturers use deliberative dialogue approaches in their teaching, and whether and how novel forms could be tried out. So that's basically what I'll do. I mean, I think you get the general drift of this. I'll see if I can put these into the chat. I mean, we have